You know, there's that saying about holding a grudge is like drinking poison and hoping that the other person dies. I think it's commonly accepted that forgiveness frees us from resentment. But does anything really change, or are we just not drinking the poison of resentment? I was thinking about this because I came across this video the other day of a man named Dean Otto. And he's an athlete, he's run marathons, and he was out riding his bike one day, early one morning, and unexpectedly, somebody runs into him in their car, hits his bike, and he's on the ground and he's paralyzed. He's rushed to the hospital, and the doctor tells him that he has about a 2% chance of ever walking again, which has got to be devastating for somebody who's an athlete, and that's what their passion is. But instead of moping or being upset, what Dean decides to do is he decides to forgive on the spot. And what happens next is pretty remarkable, is a year to the day later, he's running a marathon, and he runs a marathon with the guy who hit him in the car, which this story just makes me think, did forgiveness really change anything? Did forgiveness lead him to have this ability to have physical recovery? And so it actually reminds me of a story in the Bible that's found in Mark 2. And if you remember, it's about a paralyzed man as well. That there's this man who's paralyzed, and he has these friends who care about him, and they carry him to this house, and they cut down the roof of the house, and they lower him into this house and place him at the feet of Jesus. And Jesus sees this man who's paralyzed, and instead of even commenting on his physical condition, he says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." So there's this stark contrast between physical healing and then Jesus just mentioning about your forgiveness of sins, and this paralyzed man gets up and walks. So does forgiveness really change anything? Is there any link between forgiveness and physical healing? So as a business professor, I decided to head to the research and look to see what does the data say. And the first thing that I found was that Mayo Clinic, they say that when somebody forgives, that it lowers their blood pressure and it decreases their chances of having any anxiety or depression, which that's huge, right? But then there's more studies out there too, saying that people who suffer from a heart attack, that if they go through forgiveness training, that it reduces their chances of having a secondary heart attack, which is a big deal. Fred Luskin, he is a professor over at Stanford University, and he is probably one of the forefront people who has studied forgiveness and its impact. And one of the most compelling studies that he had was he worked with these women from Northern Ireland who had a son that was murdered, and they went through forgiveness training. And after this forgiveness training, these women were able to forgive, and it lowered their anxiety, their blood pressure. They were able to have self-confidence. They were able to move on in life. The interesting thing about this forgiveness training is that there's multiple steps to it. It's not just saying, hey, I forgive. They have to first really understand the hurt of what happened. They have to fully experience, goodness, I just lost a son, and what that means, and just the hurt and the intensity of that. Then they have to process through that pain and be able to grieve that loss of a loved one that's no longer there. And there's multiple steps that they go through together as a group. There's another study that's based on forgiveness. It's from Friedman and Enright, and they actually worked with incest survivors, and they went through the same forgiveness training. And these incest survivors were able to move on in life and be able to forgive, and it was very helpful for them as well. So that's what the data says, but I'd like to share a little bit about my story and an experience that I had with forgiveness. So as a business professor, I was working with some students one year to work on a business plan competition, and we were working the whole year on this, and finally came to the finals, and they gave their business plan presentation, and there was a big banquet. And so when I arrive at the banquet, I'm so excited to see my students and to find out how they placed. And up front, in the front of the room, there's all of the business professors that were part of this coaching team sitting together. And the seat that I was assigned was in the very back of the room, removed from all of my colleagues. And immediately I was hurt because I knew that I was assigned this seat because there was this interpersonal conflict with the person who was organizing the seating arrangements. And so I just felt so hurt, and I could have just sat in that moment and just been frustrated, and it probably would have been justified to think I deserve to be at this other table. But I knew that if I held on to that grudge, that I would not be able to be present and listen to what was happening at this banquet. And so I chose in that moment, I'm going to forgive and I'm going to be present and I'm going to enjoy this moment. And it was really neat because my students that were at this business plan competition, they won first place. And it was so exciting. There was this huge celebration. It was great. They got their award and they cut through the whole audience and they came to the back of the banquet where I was sitting and they found me and we got to rejoice and we got to celebrate together, and it was really neat. It was a moment that I would not have gotten to have if I was sitting with all of the other business professors. I would have just been one of many that were coaching them, but we got to have this private experience just together. And it makes me think, did my forgiveness, did it just clear me from bitterness and being upset? Or did it create this pathway that we would be able to celebrate? And I know that my experience is a little bit different than Dean Otto's, but there could be this parallel there as well. Does forgiveness just free us from resentment and bitterness? Or does it open this door to celebration, to friendship, to love, to being able to run a marathon, to be able to experience life in its fullness?